Questions is, what's the degree of, strictly kind of scientific conceptualization. I think, in the case of Shannon, he's dealing with a very specific kind of set of problems, and he's thinking about it in a kind of very bounded fashion, and the kind of way in which people like Wiener and others then are much more willing to expand those ideas to a much wider conceptualization. And the observation that the discussion started off, in a very loose way, which were in a kind of as if, well, what if the brain was like a computer? And imperceptibly, but rather quickly, things have just moved to the brain is a computer. And so there's kind of this slippage from scientific kind of metaphor to ontological statements. And I think when we go back to this early moment, this early informational regime, there's a real question about what's the how much of it is grounded in kind of specific kind of scientific inquiry, and how much of it becomes kind of meta ontology that then frames the way in which subsequent investigations are made, and becomes a kind of background assumption behind all kinds of forms of knowledge production. And of course, in doing so, brings with it these kind of metaphorical transfers bring with them all sorts of kind of baggage, cultural dispositions. For example, drive towards control, or the desire to create kind of a closed world in Edwards's. Another way in which that gets expressed is through game theory. That becomes this is another von Neumann's kind of contributions. That becomes very important in the context of the Cold War and nuclear deterrence, where effectively you in order to produce a scheme for deterrence, you need to assume a certain kind of mode of rational cost-benefit analysis in the enemy, which ultimately mirrors your own. And that becomes the kind of main mode of engagement with the adversary. And in fact, to quite a large extent, the kind of strategic approach to the Vietnam War was largely to translate those kinds of game theoretical models that had been applied to the Soviets to the Vietnamese, and simply to say, well, if we hurt them enough, we will show them that the costs of continuing to continue their activities is going to outweigh any particular benefits they can receive, which then kind of strips away from the North Vietnamese any kind of historical context to the struggle they were engaged in, the way in which they might conceive this as part of a decade, if not century-old struggle for national independence, and so on. So in a way, it is, of course, mechanism, because if you think of it in terms of purely rational decision-making and objective measurements of cost of benefits, then it's not clear that there's a real subjective interiority attached to it. I mean, I would incline to thinking that there is a tension between this kind of computational mode and just technologically intensive mode of war, and a certain kind of anthropological, mythical conception of the warrior, which centers around the kind of an idea of agency, of kind of commitment to certain values that stand above kind of instrumentalism, around ideas of warrior codes and honors and so on, which are kind of typified in quite a marked transcultural way. And so, this shift towards kind of a mode of whether the combatant is more often kind of an engineer or technician, maybe a master of machines at best, but more often in which agency is really distributed, and also where conventional notions of military, more martial valor are difficult to locate. If you're bombing, from an aircraft 30,000 feet, you may need to be brave if you're exposed to fire, but you're not really placed in a kind of in a conventional terrain of martial feats. And of course, that's even more remote when you're a drone pilot in an air-conditioned booth, 20,000 kilometers from the targets. What we see, though, I think, is this being picked up nonetheless by the kind of the military cadre. Your Westmorlands, your officer classes are the ones who kind of really buy into the vision of high-tech war. I think there's often more skepticism about that at the lower levels of command, or in elements of the military which are more wedded to certain kinds of traditional understandings of their position. So, it's interesting, for instance, to see like the Marine Corps are among those who have kind of pushed this idea of chaoplexity most, because in some ways it links them back to certain ideas about the uncertainty of the battlefield, and therefore the kind of the role for the individual or the decision maker. Although, of course, that in turn kind of easily gets subsumed into the informational regime as well. But I think there is a tension, but that's not incompatible with also kind of a sublimation of kind of certain kinds of martial ethos into a kind of hyper-technicized version. And we touched onto that last week, but we already saw in the first half of the 20th century kind of fascist visions of the man-machine that kind of tried to fuse the kind of traditional martial ideals with technology. So I think you could cut that both ways, I think. But I do think that there is a tension, and there's a way in which kind of military institutions have been transformed from within as well by that kind of embrace of technology, and it has, I think, to a large extent, produced a kind of crisis of the traditional self-understanding of the military.